Briefly, I talk and then I give the word to our professor, Gamze Öztürmez. I would like to say welcome to Professor Solms and to everyone. And I want to thank Mark for accepting our invite again. It has been a long journey altogether since the initiation of the Turkish Neuropsychoanalysis Group. Since 20 years, Mark has been a great supporter for us. I would like to thank for that precious support as well. And this is the sixth time we are hosting Professor Solms as the Turkish group. Just before everyone joined in, we were chatting about the nostalgia of this journey. And it is always nice to come together again and to witness each other's journey as well. So welcome everyone. I'd like to give the word to our esteemed Professor Gamze Öztürmez, who is the representative of the Turkish Neuropsychoanalysis Group and who is also an affiliated professor at the International Psychoanalytical University in Berlin. Gamze, the word is yours.
Thank you very much, Gökçe. So, good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Turkey Neuropsychoanalysis Working Group, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's seminar, The Only Cure by Professor Mark Solms. This evening, we have the privilege of engaging with one of the leading figures bridging psychoanalysis and neuroscience. In his latest book, The Only Cure, Professor Solms revisits Freud's concept of the talking cure in light of contemporary neuroscience, presenting compelling evidence that psychotherapies can be both highly effective and enduring. At the same time, he critically re-examines Freud's ideas, showing where they hold and where they may need revision. His work invites us to return to a fundamental question: what truly heals and why? Before we begin, I would like to briefly acknowledge those who have contributed to the development of neuropsychoanalysis in Turkey. My sincere thanks to Dr. Gökçe Özkarar for her pioneering role in introducing neuropsychoanalysis to Turkey, and to Associate Professor Yasemin Hoşgören, the former representative of the Turkey NPSA group. I would also like to thank Emeritus Professor Güler Fişek, Professor Barış Korkmaz, and Professor Hakan Atalay for their continuous support, as well as Emir Özel for his valuable contributions to our community. And of course, my thanks to all members of the Turkey Neuropsychoanalysis community for keeping this space alive. Tonight's seminar will be conducted in English and followed by a Q&A session. It is now my great honor to introduce Professor Solms. Professor Mark Solms is a pioneering neuropsychologist and psychoanalyst, widely recognized as the founder of neuropsychoanalysis. He is director at neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town and science director of the American Psychoanalytic Association. His work on the neuroscience of dreaming has transformed our understanding of the mind. He is the author of over 350 scientific articles and several influential books, including The Hidden Spring and The Only Cure. Professor Solms, we are truly honored to have you with us. Thank you all for joining us. And now I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Mark Solms.
Thank you very, very much. I'm pleased that the tone of your introduction has been so warm and personal, because my plan for this evening is to give you a very informal, intimate introduction to this book. I'm not going to give you a formal lecture with slides. I'm just going to tell you the main ideas and something of the background to this book, and then leave plenty of time for us to have questions and answers at the end. I'm mindful of the fact that most of you in probably all of you, already well versed in neuropsychoanalysis. So I'm not going to say all the obvious basic things. I'm going to give you a little bit more of the details. So here we go. Why did I write this book? Well, a few years ago, in fact, 2 years ago, the revised standard edition was published. That is a new or a revised English edition of Freud's complete psychological works. And when those came out, my publishers said to me that this is a great opportunity for me to write something about Freud. And I had spent 29 years doing that translation. So, I was a little bit tired of writing about Freud. What made matters even worse was that they wanted me to write about the translating of Freud. And I thought, that's not interesting enough. So I decided I would write it. I thought they were right, that the occasion of the publication of the new English edition of Freud's psychological works, is a suitable moment to publish something about Freud. For me, as the person who has spent so many years engaged with translating him, it seemed like a suitable moment to say something about him. But I didn't want to talk about translating Freud from German into English. I wanted to speak about translating Freud from the early 20th century to the early 21st century. I wanted to translate Freud in the sense of a translation of what his ideas were about all those years ago into a language that modern day mental scientists and neuroscientists would understand. But I wasn't writing for scientists only. So I wanted also to make it understandable to the general public. How does a modern neuroscientist, a modern cognitive scientist, how does Freud fare from a modern point of view? Now, as you no doubt all know, Freud has many critics. He also has many hero worshippers, and it seems that there are very few of us who are in between those two poles. So I tried very hard to adopt that middle ground. In other words, to try as objectively as I could to evaluate Freud's ideas from the point of view of modern science, not to praise him and turn him into a prophet, nor to attack him, to become a Freud basher, but to try and find some sort of moderate, reasonably objective view. So that's what I'm now going to try to summarize for you, what I think is a reasonably objective view of how we might see Freud's contribution and when I say Freud's contribution, I mean both as a scientist and in terms of the talking therapy that he developed. How does all of this stack up from the point of view of our own century? So that's what I'm now going to do, is give you really just the headlines of what I'm arguing in this book. And I'm not giving it to you in the sequence of the book. I'm not following the chapters of the book. I'm just trying to convey to you some of the main ideas. So I start with the fact, in fact, you might be amused, those of you who don't know this, I never intended to translate Freud's psychological writings. I wanted to translate Freud's neuroscientific writings, and I began to do that as early as 1989. And then I got distracted by the psychological works. From 1995, I started to do the revision of Freud's psychological works in English. And only now in the last 2 years have I been able to return to what I wanted to do in the first place, which was to translate Freud's neuroscientific works. So I want to begin by telling you something about Freud's neuroscientific works, because I think it's important for people to know where did psychoanalysis come from? The fact that Freud was a neuroscientist and then transitioned into psychoanalysis, which incidentally is the same path that I followed, I think that's important. I think that especially for those of us now who are wanting to make that transition in the other direction, in other words, to find connections back to the neurosciences from psychoanalysis, I think it's important to see how psychoanalysis developed out of the neurosciences. So I'll just quickly tell you, I could talk for hours just about that, but I'll just give you a few basic pointers. Freud published his first neuroscientific paper in 1878, and he published his last one in 1900. So that's a period of 23 years. And during that period, he published, if you count the minor works, he published more than 200 titles. So that's a lot. I was introduced to you a few minutes ago, you heard I've published 350 titles. Well, that's been in my whole life. Freud published over 200 titles just in his preliminary neuroscientific years. He started, in fact, amusingly, his very first paper had nothing to do with the nervous system. His very first paper was an attempt to find the testicles of the eel. It was a great mystery in biology how eels reproduce, because although the female reproductive organs had been found, nobody could find an eel with male reproductive organs. So this was the first question, and it is very funny that Freud, who later discovered the castration complex, that he started out looking for the missing testicles of the eel, and he couldn't find them. But then from his second paper onwards, he was doing neuroscience. And he began with a very fundamental question, which is, what are the basic elements of the nervous system? Now, today, we all know what the basic elements are. They're neurons. But neurons were discovered in 1891. Freud was writing on this topic in 1878. So, a good few years before the neuron was discovered. The question was, can it be possible that the nervous system, the organ of the soul, that it is made of cells like any other bodily organ? It's very difficult for us from our vantage point today to realize that this was a shocking idea, that the brain is just the same as any other organ of the body and it's made of cells. So Freud made fundamental contributions to the discovery of the neuron, so much so that a recent book on the topic of how the neuron was discovered devoted a whole chapter to Freud's contributions. So he started with the most fundamental question of what is the nervous system made of? And he made basic contributions to the discovery of the neuron. Then he moved, and he did that in crayfish, invertebrates, and also in a very primitive vertebrate, which was the lamprey. It's a very, very primitive fish. And he was studying their spinal cords, the spinal cord of the lamprey. Then he started to study the connections in the spinal cord, not just the individual neurons, but how they connected. And then he moved up to the brain stem. And when he moved up to the brain stem, he moved from lower vertebrates, fishes, to humans. And he didn't study adult humans, he studied fetus, human fetal brains, because their connections are simpler. Before the whole brain myelinates, it's easier to see what's going on, because otherwise it becomes too complicated. And there Freud made basic contributions. So, for example, what we now know as the vestibular cochlear nerve, one of the basic cranial nerves, Freud was the person who traced its origin, its nucleus in the brainstem. Freud was the person who described how the cerebellum connects to the pons, what the basic connections are. I mean, this sort of thing. We don't, when we learn the anatomy of the brain, we forget that somebody had to first of all describe these things. And these very basic things Freud described. And then he moved higher into the forebrain. And at the same time, he moved from anatomy to neurology. In other words, he started to study clinical conditions. And again, he began with children. So it's not widely recognized. Freud was one of the foremost European authorities on the movement disorders of childhood and therefore cerebral palsy. He wrote 3 books on cerebral palsy, 3 books, big ones, fat books, hundreds of pages. And then from pediatric neurology, he moved to neuropsychology. And the topic that he focused on was language, brain mechanisms of language. In other words, the aphasias. And he wrote a really brilliant book on aphasia. Anybody in aphasiology who knows anything about the history of the field knows that that was a landmark contribution. And I want to emphasize that what Freud's contribution was to argue that we can't localize whole mental functions in centers in the cortex. He said not only that they are distributed, he said it's a complex functional system. It's not localized mental functions assigned to particular tissues of the brain. More than that, the idea that it's a network, that it's a functional system, which of course is the way we all think nowadays. More than that, he said that in order to understand the disorders of language, we have to use concepts that are linguistic, because you can't use physiological or anatomical concepts to understand the disorders of language. You have to use language concepts. Things, like nowadays we speak of, phonology and semantics and so on. Freud, using the linguistics of his time, said this is how we can understand language. And why that's so important is that there already he's starting to say we have to study psychological phenomena psychologically. Even if the etiological mechanism of the disorder is physical, still you can't understand mental functions unless you understand them in mental terms. And then came the transition to what we nowadays call functional neurological disorders, what was then called hysteria. And the crucial thing with hysteria is there is no lesion. So you can see how the progression that Freud had made via language made it possible for him to use psychological concepts to understand the functions that are impaired in hysteria without having to use anatomical concepts. And the crucial point that Freud made there was that an hysterical paralysis, for example, the paralysis, say, of the right arm, it doesn't follow the anatomy of how the arm is represented in the brain. It follows the idea of the arm. And he said the arm is paralyzed from fingers to shoulder because that's what the idea of the arm is. But of course, in terms of how the upper limb is represented in the cortex, there isn't, you can't have a lesion that just affects the arm and that affects it equally from hand to shoulder. It will affect other structures too, and it will affect the hand more severely than it affects the shoulder, and so on. And so Freud said, and this is that quote that many of you may have heard before, he said, in hysterical paralysis, the paralysis behaves as if anatomy doesn't exist or as if it had no knowledge of it. So that was the transition. And I hope that you can see it's a continuous transition, starting with individual neurons through the spinal cord, through the brainstem, into clinical neurology, and ultimately into mental disorders arising from neurological disease, that is aphasia, and then from that into functional neurological disorders. Because those days there were no methods for studying the living brain, the only method they had was autopsy. So, and in the case of hysteria, at autopsy there was nothing to see. So it was really a completely sensible scientific approach to start using psychological methods of observation and psychological methods of testing your hypotheses about how the function is put together. So that's Freud, the neuroscientist, and you can see how psychoanalysis developed out of this. Now I want to say, what about when Freud developed his psychological model of the functions of the mental apparatus, as he called it? Because he spoke about the language apparatus, and then he moved to the mental apparatus. In other words, not just language, but the whole functional apparatus of the mind. The first point I want to make clear is that that was a novelty. The idea that we can dissect the function. That was the way that Freud put it. He said, I'm not dissecting the organ, I'm dissecting the function. And he said, and I'm quoting him, he said that I realize this is a scientific novelty to dissect the function. It hasn't been done before, but I can see no harm in it, so long as we do not confuse the scaffolding with the building. I think it's a beautiful phrase, that what we're studying is the function rather than the anatomy and physiology. That is the major transition into what became meta-psychology. In other words, trying to understand the function that lies behind the observable phenomena. And the observable phenomena can be physiological or psychological. That doesn't matter. What we're trying to understand is the underlying functional organization. There's another point Freud, another phrase that he used, which I'd like to quote, which was that mental functions are not localized in the elements of the nervous system. Rather, they are distributed between them. That's, again, a beautiful image, that the function can't be localized. It's a virtual thing, was what he said. It's something which doesn't exist in a particular tissue. It's a principle that organizes the functions of multiple distributed tissues. Now, functionalism, this idea that what we're trying to understand is the function. If you just pause for a moment, you will realize that's what we do in cognitive neuroscience today. We're not studying cells, we're not studying tissues, we're studying functions. So, for example, we want to understand the function of memory. We want to understand the function of perception. We want to understand the function of skilled movement or executive control, etc. So what we are trying to do is to discern the underlying functional organization of the mental instrument, just as Freud did. What is not generally recognized is that the very idea of functionalism was Freud's idea, and he introduced it in the 1890s. Normally, we are told that it was a innovation of Hilary Putnam, the philosopher of mind, from the 1950s. In fact, it was a novelty of our own field. And you will see in what I'm about to say over the next few minutes that this is a general theme, that there were many things that have science and affective neuroscience that we genuinely have rediscovered. We haven't tried to find, was Freud right or wrong? We don't care about that. What we're trying to do is understand how the mind works and how the brain works. and how the two are connected. And the connecting link is this idea of function. But the point I'm wanting to make is that in doing so, we're following, in fact, the basic sketch that Freud gave us, namely that we should be looking at the function. The functional organization is what matters. Now, the next thing I want to say in terms of what contributions, how can we see, how does Freud's approach look from the point of view of modern neuroscience? I've already said functionalism is the first idea, which looks rather modern, that idea. It's completely what we all do now in cognitive neuroscience. But now I want to come to a second one, which is Freud's perspective, because the methods that he had, I've told you already, there were no neurophysiological methods. Even the EEG hadn't been invented. There was no way of studying the functions of the living brain physiologically. The only empirical method that we had of studying the human brain during life, the only methods were psychological. So it was in the spirit of good empirical science that Freud didn't make guesses about the physiology. There were no methods. The only methods were psychological, and so he used those. But now that leads me to that second point I wanted to make, which is, you know where we are today with our hard problem of consciousness. David Chalmers makes much of what he calls the epistemic gap, the explanatory gap. We have physiological methods in neuroscience, and we dissect the function, and we say this is the function of vision. This is how it's organized. And then Chalmers says, yes, but why do you experience it? Chalmers's whole argument is that the functional mechanism of that underpins the physiological observations doesn't explain why there's a subjective experience at all. So I think it's very important, although Freud was forced to do so, I think it's very important to recognize in relation to this problem that Chalmers has pointed out, that Freud's starting point was the subjective experiences themselves. For Chalmers, it's like, where do we fit the subjective experiences in? We haven't accounted for those using our physiological methods and abstracting the mechanism, the function behind the physiological observations. Freud was saying, well, let's start with the subjective experiences themselves, and let's try and discern the mechanism that lies behind that. So this idea that we have to somehow find this missing link to subjectivity. In psychoanalysis, there is no missing link. We started with subjectivity. We don't have to try and find a place to fit it into our picture of the mind. It is our starting point. We start with the lived experience of being a mind, and then we try and understand what the functional mechanisms are that lie behind that. I hardly need to tell this group that neuropsychoanalysis arises from the assumption that if we are, both of us, studying the function from the point of view of physiology or from the point of view of subjective experience, then the connecting common ground between our fields is the underlying functions. You can study the underlying functions both objectively, physiologically, or subjectively, psychologically, and you come somewhere the two ends of the microscope must join. This is what we're trying to do in neuropsychoanalysis. Now that we have physiological methods, is to see, to try to correct viewpoint-dependent errors. And I really need to emphasize there are viewpoint-dependent errors, not only in psychoanalysis, which is hampered by the fact that we use subjective observations, but there are also viewpoint-dependent errors from the physiological point of view, because you will never understand how the brain works, how the mental apparatus works, if you leave out of account the absolutely remarkable fact that it has subjectivity. that the fact that it feels like something to be a brain surely tells us something about how this part of nature works. Surely the feelings, the subjective experiences do something. And if you leave those things out, you won't understand how the thing works, because if the subjective experiences do something, if they have causal consequences, then clearly, if you only look at it from the objective point of view, you're going to be leaving out half the data. I hope I'm not the only person in this meeting who, when he looks back over his life, comes to the conclusion that what he felt made a difference to what he did. Okay, I think that you will never understand why I've done what I've done in my life if you don't understand that I have feelings that determine what I do. Basically, what I do, and I believe probably all of us, is I do things which make me feel better, and I avoid things that make me feel worse. And this is why I think that the subjective point of view on the brain, which is what Freud inaugurated with psychoanalysis. What can we learn about how this part of nature works by studying its subjective experiential aspect? So then I'll move on from there and say one of Freud's first observations in doing this, in studying the mind subjectively, studying the mental instrument subjectively, he came to the conclusion that actually a lot of the things that motivate us to do what we do, the things that cause us to feel what we feel, we're not aware of them. And so he introduced this radical idea that part of the mind is unconscious. And you say, radical idea, really? What's radical about that? Well, put yourself back in 1900 when Freud was saying these things. It was completely absurd, his colleagues said, to say that there are mental functions which are unconscious. They said it's an oxymoron. Mental means conscious. You can't speak of an unconscious consciousness. But Freud insisted there are things that influence us, psychological things like memories, things that we have learnt that influence what we do, that we're not aware that we've learnt, that we don't remember. And so there must be unconscious memories. There must be unconscious mental processes. And nowadays, I hardly even need to say it. Everyone knows in cognitive neuroscience that a very large portion, in fact, a much larger portion than Freud even dared to suggest, of our mental functions are indeed unconscious. And we can prove this experimentally, and we have since the 1970s and 80s and 90s. It is not even remotely controversial that large portions of the mind are unconscious. So I'm saying that this is the basic picture of the mind that Freud described 100 years ago. And it's basically the same picture that we've come to today. I need to go quickly through these other things. Each of them deserves an hour on their own, but I'll just quickly go through some other things that flow from this. The first is that we are driven, that we have drives, that we are whatever else we human beings are. Homo sapiens is a species of animal, and that we are driven just like all other creatures are. This again was considered completely shocking. It was in Victorian times, it was completely outrageous to suggest that we are animals, that we have animal biological urges that motivate what we do. But that too, as you well know, is no longer controversial at all. So everything in affective neuroscience, from Panksepp to Damasio to Ledoux, we all know that the mind is embodied. Embodied cognition is like a standard phrase nowadays in modern mental science. But that too is basically a Freudian idea, the idea that mental cognitive functions are embodied. Now I want to, under the heading of drives, I'll come back to that later, because there's the question of how Freud classified those drives. But I'm for now just speaking about the mere existence of drives, that the mind is driven biologically, that the mind does work on behalf of the organism. This was a basic the idea that we now call embodied cognition was again an innovation of psychoanalysis. Nowadays we speak about drives, and again I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but the whole point is drives are homeostatic, and we have to maintain our homeostasis, and in order to do so we have to have predictions as to what to do in order to satisfy our needs. In other words, in order to stay in homeostasis. We speak about this as predictive processing. And this, as you all know, is the dominant paradigm in cognitive neuroscience today, the predictive processing paradigm. So I just want to slow down for a moment so that I can emphasize this point. What is a prediction? A prediction is a wish. In other words, in the past, when I did this, it led to the satisfaction of my need. In other words, the returning of me to homeostasis. So I believe if I do that again in the future, I will again satisfy my need. That's exactly how Freud conceptualized wish, which he said is the basic mechanism of cognition. And so when we speak about predictive processing today, we're speaking about exactly that, again, basic Freudian idea, that we're trying to repeat experiences of satisfaction, and we're trying to avoid noxious experiences on the basis of what's happened in the past. We predict what we should do in the future. Memories are about the past, but they're for the future. And to illustrate how dramatically our nowadays dominant paradigm of predictive processing is the same idea. There was a paper a few years ago published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, which is a very eminent cognitive neuroscience journal, by Friston and others, which had the title, "All Thinking is Wishful Thinking." That was the title of a paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. Can you believe it? All thinking is wishful thinking. I mean, what could be a more Freudian idea than that? So that's the basic idea of the predictive processing paradigm. Now, I said earlier about the unconscious aspects of the mind and what an innovation that was. What I want to do now is just quickly build upon that. You remember Freud said there's not only an unconscious level to the mind, he said there's also a pre-conscious level. And this idea he introduced in 1896, the idea that there are multiple memory systems. That's how he put it, that memories are transcribed not once, but many times over in different forms of transcription. This is what he said in 1896. And that became the basis of that model in chapter 7 of the interpretation of dreams, the one that diagram that we've all seen a million times. So the idea of there being multiple memory systems is a Freudian idea dating back to 1896. If you look at any textbook nowadays, they will tell you the standard model of memory is that there are multiple memory systems. And we're told that there's basically three types. There's short-term memory, which is conscious. There's declarative long-term memory, which can become conscious. And then there's non-declarative long-term memory, which cannot become conscious. That is the conscious, the pre-conscious, and the unconscious. It's exactly the same thing. So the idea of there being multiple memory systems, and even more astonishing, the idea that there are basically three big categories: conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious. In other words, short-term, declarative long-term, non-declarative long-term. The fact that Freud came to that idea from purely subjective psychological observations, I think it's extraordinary. Who gets the credit for the multiple memory systems model? It's Tolman. And Tolman invented the idea of multiple memory systems in the 1940s, in other words, 50 years later than Freud. And to add insult to injury, Tolman was a behaviorist. So a behaviorist gets the credit for the multiple memory systems model, which is really a Freudian model. I could go on. I will just add two more points. I could go on. The idea of critical periods was a Freudian idea. Critical periods, Freud called them dispositional fixation points, but the idea that early experience is crucial and that there are particular phases when particular things have their biggest impact upon us is again basically the whole of this epigenetic sort of idea of critical periods again. And that Semir Zeki, who is Turkish, he acknowledges this in a wonderful chapter in his book entitled A Vision of the Brain. There's a whole chapter on Freud and critical periods. Zeki focused on Freud's paper on Leonardo as an example of this. And then there's defenses. I want to end with the idea of defenses because this brings us up to date with neuropsychoanalysis, where we have made fundamental observations in the case of, for example, anosognosia, and in the example of confabulatory amnesia, where we've shown that there are defensive mechanisms at work here. And I think that it's truly remarkable that a lesion to a particular part of the brain, the right parietal lobe, will bring about a narcissistic sort of defense, and that a lesion to these anterior diencephalic regions will bring out this psychotic defense, which we see in Korsakoff psychosis. I think that here is a basic idea, obviously a Freudian idea, which gives you a sense of how much we're missing in neuroscience, in neuropsychology, if we don't make use of psychodynamic concepts, because we showed empirically that anosognosia has a defensive structure and that confabulatory amnesia has a defensive structure. So much so that the wonderful neurologist Villeneuve Ramachandran, he wrote a letter to the American magazine called Scientific American, and there he said, you know, what Solms is saying is correct. Defenses exist. They're part of nature. They're a very important part of how the brain works. And he said the only problem is the neuroscientific community is in denial about it, which I thought was a wonderful joke, saying that the neuroscientific community is in denial about denial. So this is a survey of some of the basic concepts that I think have been rediscovered and are being rediscovered, and really that our modern conception of how the mental instrument works is very, very consistent with the basic Freudian idea. Now, I told you I was going to be balanced, so let me balance it by pointing out what Freud got wrong. And it's not surprising that he got things wrong. I mean, Newton got things wrong about the basic laws of physics. But you know, nobody says therefore he should be written out of history. He was a pioneer of physics, like Darwin was a pioneer, you know, of evolutionary biology. There's a lot that Darwin didn't know. There's a lot that Darwin got wrong, and the same applies to Freud. So I don't know why we make such a fuss about this in the case of Freud, that he got some things wrong, but he did get some things wrong, and I think we have to be clear about that. I think that the biggest error that Freud made was his classification of the drives. And it's no accident that Freud made big changes in the way he classified the drives. He started with his first theory that there are self-preservative versus sexual drives. And then his second theory, when he combined the self-preservative and the sexual drives into life drives, and he said that there's a basic conflict between two categories of drive, life drives and death drives. When he said that in 1920, he said, this is not a purely psychological topic. He said, we have to look to biology for answers as to how to classify the drives. He says it very, very clearly that we have to look to biology as to how to classify the drives. And he said our ideas, his ideas, might be completely wrong. And they, frankly, were completely wrong. So the single most important way in which we need to revise psychoanalytic theory is to replace Freudian drive theory with a modern drive theory, and the best drive theory we have today is that of the dear Jaak Panksepp. So it's a massive, I mustn't glide over this. It's a massive shift in theory to recognize that there are 7 drives. And what makes this massive shift in theory especially important, and here I hope I don't lose your support or your sympathy for my way of thinking, but I need to make it clear that among those 7 drives, only one of them is sexual. For Freud, sexuality was a much more important part of our mental makeup than I believe is justified. And I'm going to explain now what I mean by that, because I think this was Freud's second big error. I'm not saying that I mean, the fact that Freud emphasized sexuality is not surprising, because any biologist knows that the basic thing that keeps a species going is sexuality. But by sexuality is meant reproduction. And Freud's main point, a hugely important point that Freud made, was that we don't have sex in order to reproduce. So I want to now go into, I think there Freud made another very valuable contribution, but at the same time he made a big mistake. The valuable contribution was this. Freud said, we don't have sex in order to reproduce. We're not trying to do our biological duty when we have sex. Why do we have sex? It's because it's nice. We like it. It feels good. In other words, what motivates us is the feeling. We're not performing our biological duty to reproduce. In fact, most of the time when we have sex, we're trying not to reproduce. That's why we use contraceptives. So it makes no sense. If sex is there for the reproductive function, then, why do we have sex with contraception? Why do we masturbate? How can you ever reproduce by masturbating? Why do we have gay sex? How can 2 people of the same sex ever produce a baby? By copulating with each other. And why do we do all the other interesting things that we do in sex? Like, for example, with our mouths, I mean, how's that going to produce babies? And so this is what Freud was saying, and it's absolutely obviously true. So Freud said, what motivates us is not the biological function, but the feeling. And we know that the feeling attaches to the biological function because this motivates us to perform that biological function. But it isn't what motivates the subject of the mind. This is the difference between biology and psychology. The mind is first and foremost subjective. And what motivates us, as I said earlier in this talk, is feelings. So that's why we have sex. It's because we like it. It's also why we eat chocolate. It's because it tastes nice. It's not because it's got high glucose content. This was Freud's point, that we are motivated by feelings. And then Freud said, look at the baby who suckles at the breast, even though it's already well nourished. It's fed, but it carries on sucking away. Freud says, you see, this is just for the pleasure of it. And that's a big contribution. Okay, to say what motivates the subject of the mind is the feelings, not some underlying biological imperative. But here's when he made the mistake. Then Freud said, therefore, everything that we do just for the pleasure of it is actually sexual. So Freud said sexual, he redefined the word sexual to mean for the purposes of pleasure and only for the purposes of pleasure. It has no self-preservative function. It is only for the purposes of pleasure. So he extended the meaning of the word sexual. And it's understandable why he did that. Because, as I said, clearly there are many things we do which are not reproductive, but which are obviously sexual, like, as I said, masturbation and gay sex And then Freud pointed out perverse sexual practices, exhibitionism, voyeurism, sadomasochism, fetishism. All of these things are plainly sexual, but also plainly done not for the purposes of reproduction, but rather for the purposes of pleasure. But Freud went beyond that and said, therefore, everything that is done only for the purposes of pleasure, we should call it sexual. And I think that's confusing. So I said earlier, we eat chocolate because it tastes nice. Freud said, therefore, it's sexual. Babies suckle at the breast even though they are well fed. Freud said, that's sexual. Children love to go on swings and roundabouts and they squeal with delight. Freud said, that's sexual. And eventually, people started saying that's crazy, to call children playing on swings and roundabouts sexual. I mean, there's something wrong with you. And I hope you can see why Freud was saying that, but I hope you can also see why it's a mistake. So the important thing that Freud said was it's the pleasure, the feeling that motivates us. The mistake that he made was to think that every form of pleasure in the brain is sexual. And this brings us back to the classification of the drives. I told you there are 7 emotional drives, let alone all the bodily drives. And of those 7 emotional drives, one of them is sexual. We call it lust. And it has a particular chemistry, and it has a particular circuitry, and it is completely different from the circuitry for attachment bonding, for example, which is what the baby is doing when it stays at the fuzzy, warm breast, even though it doesn't need to feed. It's satisfying a different drive, which is the drive to attach. And the child who's on the swings and the roundabouts is satisfying yet another drive, which is the drive to play, and so on. So the point is, Freud was right to draw attention to the incredibly important causal power of feelings, bringing subjectivity into natural science and into neuroscience, that feelings do something, they explain why we act and behave the way we do, but that there are more than one pleasure in the brain, and that it's just scientifically wrong to say that they're all reducible to one overarching thing. And so that's, I think, Freud's biggest mistake, and I think that it needs to be clearly acknowledged. So now I'm aware that I've spoken for about 50 minutes, and I must round things off so that we can have time for questions and answers. But there's still a few things I want to say. Going back to what I said earlier about the basic ideas that drives are homeostatic and that we have to have predictions as to how to satisfy them. I will add to that, we are born with predictions. They're called instincts, but they are too crude, too basic, too stereotyped. So we have to learn to supplement our instincts with acquired, individualized ways of how do I meet my needs in the particular environmental niche that I find myself in. And I think that's the basic task of mental development. The basic task of mental development is learning from experience how to meet our needs. It's a basically Freudian idea, but it's also a no-brainer, if you'll excuse the pun. That's what we're doing. The whole of mental development is learning how to meet our needs. And now, the next crucial thing is that to the extent that we fail to learn how to meet our emotional needs, to that extent we're going to suffer from emotional feelings, because that's what feelings are. Feelings tell us whether we're in homeostasis or not. If we're moving out of homeostasis in regard to any one of those emotional drives I described earlier, it's a particular type of unpleasure, panic, fear, sexual frustration, rage, etc. That's what feelings are. And so there you have the basic idea of what we're dealing with in the patient population that we treat. We're treating people who suffer from emotions. Our patients suffer first and foremost from feelings, and that's why they come to us. They want to get rid of these feelings that so distress them. That means there are two things you can do. This is the two great approaches to mental health care. The one thing you can do is you can give the patient a pill. to take away the feeling. That's what we do with antidepressants, with anti-anxiety drugs, etc. We're trying to help the patient to get rid of these feelings. And patients are very grateful to the extent that we're able to do that. And I have to say, to the extent that we're able to do that, because of course we can't really completely take away feelings, but it doesn't stop us from trying. And of course there are side effects, but everything we've done in psychopharmacology is basically to suppress unpleasant feelings. But please note in what I've said, what those unpleasant feelings are, they are symptoms which are symptomatic of something. The underlying cause of the symptom is that an emotional need is not being met. So the other approach to mental health care is to help the patient to find a better way of meeting their emotional needs. And I'm not embarrassed to say that's basically what we do. It's as simple as that. Psychotherapy is an attempt to help the patient to find better ways to meet their emotional needs. And I think that one of the great confusions among the public is the idea that psychopharmacology is proper medicine, like this is scientific medicine, and psychotherapy is like fluffy stuff that it's kind of like nice to have, but it's not really real medicine. The truth of the matter is that psychopharmacological treatments, as valuable and essential as they are symptomatic treatments. You are suppressing symptoms. You're not treating causes. I'm generalizing now, but for the very great majority of psychiatric medications, as soon as you stop taking the medication, the symptoms come back because you're not treating the cause, you're treating the symptoms. Psychotherapy, which is thought of as this fluffy thing that's not proper medicine, actually is causal therapy. It's actually treating the cause. It's actually trying to help the patient to find better ways to meet those emotional needs, which will take away the symptoms, with symptoms being symptomatic of the emotional need not being met. So this is an important part of this book, where I'm trying to explain to a general audience that that's how it works. That there's symptomatic treatments and there are causal treatments, and surprisingly, the causal treatment is the psychological treatment. I really don't want to be misunderstood, so I'll say it once more. It's very important that we have symptomatic treatments. There are patients who need symptomatic treatments, and I can give you extreme examples, like a suicidal patient. You can't say, come into psychotherapy, I'm sure you'll feel better in 2 years' time. It's an emergency. You need symptomatic treatment. There are very depressed patients who are so depressed that they can't come to psychotherapy. They have no energy or belief or optimism or hope. So symptomatic treatment is important, but I think it's important that we educate the public about the difference between symptomatic and causal therapies in psychiatry. So that leads me to what I've already said, actually, that what psychotherapy is an attempt to help patients to find better ways to meet their emotional needs. Now, please note the way that I put that. I didn't say it's to teach patients to better ways to meet their needs. I said it's to help them to find better ways. Some psychotherapies teach patients better ways of meeting their emotional needs, and there's nothing wrong with that. CBT is a very effective therapy, and again, I hope I'm not losing friends when I say that, but the evidence speaks for itself. The CBT is a very effective treatment. The problem is it's not the most effective treatment for everything. So this leads me to, what is psychoanalytic therapy for? It's for those predictions that patients execute unconsciously. It's for, remember I told you that there are 3 levels. There's the conscious and the pre-conscious and the unconscious. Conscious and pre-conscious things you can think about. And you can be persuaded by your coach or your counselor or your CBT practitioner to think through this and find better ways. But then there are things you can't think through. And these are unconscious things. The way that unconscious predictions are remembered is not to be brought back to mind. They are repeated, as Freud said. remembering is not possible for the unconscious, it's repeated. In other words, it is enacted. That's what we do when it comes to... So the psychoanalytical treatment is to treat those predictions which you can't bring back to mind, you can't remember, you can't think about, you can only enact them in what we call transference. And this is how you make the patient aware of them, is by showing them the transference, in making them aware of what they're doing now, not remembering where it came from then. Now, there's much more I could say about that, but again, I'm mindful of the time, and I'm also mindful of the fact that you're an audience of close colleagues who know all this stuff about neuropsychoanalysis. So I just want to move on from there to saying, if this is what we do in psychoanalytic, in all psychotherapy, we're helping patients find better ways to meet their emotional needs. Does it work? So this is the second last thing I want to say. A big part of my book is about this question, because it's a perfectly reasonable question. And sadly, I'm sorry to say, I need to remind you that there was a long time when psychoanalysts said, we don't need to prove that it works. We don't need to measure it. We know it works. And you can't measure the things we do in psychoanalysis and so on. And so they have only themselves to blame for the fact that when everybody else was measuring their therapies, like psychopharmacologists and CBT practitioners, they demonstrated that they work. And so, they became known as evidence-based therapies. And psychoanalysis was not evidence-based. And I say again, we have only ourselves to blame because we thought, that we're above all that. Well, sadly, that's not how it works. And so the healthcare funders, both private and public, healthcare administrators, they said, well, we think we'll go for the evidence-based therapies, thanks. And then only late in the game, we started to do proper objective measurements of how well do our therapies work. So I'm just going to say in very, very brief terms, because I must wrap up. In my book, I go into all of the evidence, and I show that psychotherapy is a very effective treatment. Psychotherapy, on the average, has effect sizes of between 0.75 and 0.8, roughly. Okay, so in medicine, as you probably know, an effective treatment has an effect size of 0.8. That is a highly effective treatment. A moderately effective treatment has an effect size of about 0.4. And a slightly effective treatment has an effect size of 0.2. So let's just remember what does slightly effective mean. Aspirin for the treatment of cardiovascular disease has an effect size of 0.2. It doesn't stop us from... I myself take aspirin because I don't want to have a heart attack. But it only has an effect size of 0.2. That doesn't mean it's nothing, okay? Guess what? Viagra has an effect size of 0.3 for the treatment of erectile dysfunction. But there are many men who swear by Viagra, but the effect size is modest, okay? 0.3. So when I say 0.3 is a slightly effective treatment, it doesn't mean it's nothing. But psychotherapy is up there with the highly effective treatments, 0.75 to 0.8. That's psychotherapy as a whole. Now, what about psychoanalytic psychotherapy? So remember, I told you we came to the game late, but we have come to the game properly, and there's now many good studies on the effectiveness and efficacy of psychoanalytic therapy. So much so that even in the Cochrane Library, which is like the most objective compendium of meta-analyses about all medical treatments, this number I just gave you, 0.75, that's what they say about psychotherapy generally in the Cochrane Library. What about psychoanalytic psychotherapy? Well, first of all, we have what's called an equivalence analysis. This was done by Leichenring. Equivalence analysis is looking at all of the data, all of the meta-analyses, and saying, is this treatment at least as good as, no less good than that treatment. And this was done comparing psychoanalytic with CBT. CBT is the evidence-based one, and it showed that the equivalence analysis showed psychoanalysis is at least no less effective than the so-called evidence-based CBT. And CBT is evidence-based, but I'm saying so is psychoanalysis. So on the average, it's as effective as CBT. But now when I say on the average, I mean, I have to leave out a hell of a lot of detail. But the important thing is, well, if it's equally good on the average, psychoanalysis so much longer and so much more frequent sessions and so much more expensive. So therefore, it's not as good as CBT. So I need to emphasize, I'm talking about studies which compare equal frequency and equal duration of treatment. In other words, equal dosage. And it's our own fault that now the standard of what is considered, an appropriate length and frequency of sessions, length of treatment, is what CBT uses. So we have to compare ourselves to that. But there are some studies which have gone looking at longer-term psychoanalytic therapies and more frequent psychoanalytic therapies, and the results are better than CBT. Of course they are. What would you expect? Because it's a higher dosage. So nevertheless, you remember, if it was me, I would want the treatment that works best, not the one that is most cost-effective for the state. I would want the treatment that works best. So the evidence is that the best outcomes are from the psychoanalytic therapies. And now here's the last thing I'm going to say on that score, which is that the very good trials that have been done recently by Marianne Leutzinger-Berleber, randomized double-blind controlled trials comparing CBT with psychoanalysis, shows that they have the same effectiveness and gets better every year the longer that the treatment goes on. Psychoanalytic treatments go on for longer and the patients continue to get better. But if you cut it off at year 1 year of treatment, then you follow up what happens at 6 months and a year and 18 months afterwards. Those who have CBT, they slowly lose the therapeutic gains. In the and this study after study after study shows with the psychoanalytic therapies, there is not a drop-off in the symptomatic gains. There isn't even just a maintenance of the symptomatic gains. The symptomatic gains continue upwards. In other words, we get more better after the end of the treatment. We continue to get better and better. That is called the sleeper effect, and it's found in study after study after study. In Marianne Leutzinger-Berleber's study, the one I've just spoken about, we eventually end up with effect sizes of 1.5 for severe major depressive disorder. We have effect sizes of 1.5. I mean, can you believe it? At follow-up. And consistently, many studies, 0.9, 1, 1.1, and so on. So it's a very effective treatment. And what does it mean that the patient continues to get better after the end of the treatment? It means you've treated the cause. And we believe the working through process, the continuing consolidation of the insights that the patient has gained and the deeper consolidation of the new predictions arising from the treatment carries on after the treatment. You don't need an analyst anymore once you've got insight into yourself. You can say, oh, I'm doing it again. I think I'll change tack. Now, I'm going to stop. I was going to add one more thing about a psychoanalytic culture. It's the last chapter of the book. The last chapter of the book is called A Cure by Love. And it speaks about what psychoanalysis has to say about society and culture and all of that. But I'm going to leave it because I've spoken for too long. And I'm now looking forward to us having some questions and answers. Thanks very much for your attention.
Professor Solms, thank you so much. I mean, this was a difficult day and you made it really marvelous. Thank you so much.